All right, hello, welcome. It's Tony Lupton, Secretary of Automotive Historians Australia. I'm here talking with Mark Bisset and Robbie Richards. Thanks both of you for joining me for this tribute to Ron Tauranac, AHA's founding patron, who sadly passed away on the 17th of July at the age of 95. And
Great
Robbie,
to be here.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Robbie, you've known Ron for a good long time. What's your impression of him as a person and as an engineer and a car designer?
I guess I'd say that he was a very shy and reserved person. He was pragmatic, and there was a no sort of nonsense approach to engineering, which I think was really honed in his younger years when he went through a wartime and depression times, that he was able to refine things back to the simplest form and just simplify everything.
Yeah, I think he struck everyone he met as a very humble sort of fellow. Didn't really seek the limelight, but he really deserved a lot more limelight than he got.
Yeah, I think he was shy, and he said that he was always shy in the early days when he was going to the dances before he met his wife. And, you know, he was a very shy and very traditional sort of person, and wasn't very comfortable with girls when he was younger, and just a very old-fashioned approach to life, and but had some very good values. And he was very fair, and he, like you said, he didn't seek the limelight. He was really the driving force behind the success of Brabham, but he didn't try to promote that. He was happy to be working behind the scenes while Jack was the spokesman and the showman, I guess, at the front.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the values. When I had a couple of opportunities to talk to Ron in detail about his career, one of the things that impressed me was just his reflections on the workforce, particularly during the Brabham years in the 60s, when he was employing quite a lot of people, something up to about 60 people at motor racing developments during those years. And he seemed to have a fairly interesting relationship and attitude towards other people, such as Colin Chapman. And he referred to Colin Chapman as having a whole lot of weekend warriors, volunteers who come along and work for nothing, and then they wouldn't get any work at Lotus during the off season, whereas Ron would employ people during the off season in manufacturing the production racing cars, and always had the view, I think an Australian view, that people were entitled to a fair wage and to be looked after in that way. And I think that was one of the things that stood out to me whenever I spoke to him, was that attitude he had of making sure that people were properly looked after and given a fair go.
Yeah, because he nearly worked for Colin. Colin wanted him to. He nearly signed a contract, and it fell apart following after Brabham. But he was always so thankful that he never did, because he just said that his views were so different to Colin's. And he referred to him at one point with me as Chunky, that Colin, which I think was a sort of a common thing, that Colin refined everything so far back that if something broke, he sort of weld a chunk on to fix it. And I think Ron was very proud of the fact that his cars really never resulted in anyone's death from poor manufacture or rushing or whatever it be. He said he could have produced double the numbers, but he never did, because he wanted to have a hand and make sure everything that went out was safe and as good as possible.
Mm. Well, Mark, you've done quite a lot of research on the era that Ron was designing and building racing cars, not only the Brabhams, but also Ralphs. And one time in your career, you owned and drove a Ralph. Perhaps you might just tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, look, I think maybe talking about the era to start with, I think of the 60s in a lot of ways as being an era of partnerships. Chapman's already been mentioned, Chapman and Clark, Fulgieri and Ferrari, Brabham and Tauranac. And I think it's one of the great partnership, or the great partnership of the era. The number of cars built, Tauranac managed to be really the preeminent manufacturer of production racing cars from circa 1960 to circa 1990. It all came to an end a couple of years before that, but let's think of it in terms of 3 decades. And that's not mentioning the front-running Formula One cars for a decade, let alone the 2 championship winners. So he's unusual in a bloke in terms of building Grand Prix championship winning cars and also sensational production racing cars, and very safe ones, as Robbie said. And in some ways, the reason for that goes to their value character, which is where you started. They were immensely pragmatic, practical blokes. Whatever his faults, Brabham, over the years, in terms of his choice of key people around him, wasn't a very astute judge of character. And Ron, he had somebody that was of a like mind, but also added significantly to his strengths and also made up for his weaknesses. And in terms of all of their cars, particularly the production racing cars, whilst Ron was really totally responsible for the design ethos of the cars and the production quality at MRD, at the end of the day, before the first BT28 went out the door, the thing was track tested by Brabham, and the baseline settings of the car were set by Jack's finely tuned arse, if I could put it that way. So it meant that the average punter had a great baseline setting to start from, rather than the R&D work starting with the customer. And there's probably only a couple of other blokes that could do that. Derek Bennett at Chevron being one of them, and our very own Gary Cooper being another. Tying that together with the car, so I owned RT4 261 with David Mottram, a mate of mine, and that is the car that Roberto Moreno used to win the 1981 Australian Grand Prix. So it's a Formula Pacific ground effect car. It's not a car I've ever raced, actually. It appeared in a matrimonial disaster, but I tested the car a number of times, and what immediately impresses you with that car and his cars generally is just the beautiful way that they are made. It's the most comfortable single-seater that I've ever sat in, and I'm far from being the biggest bloke around. And the ease of working on it were just standout points. And if you speak to owners of other Brabhams or other Rolts, they will tend to say the same things about the cars.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think one of the other things that you were saying about the way that the cars were simple and well set up. Obviously, having a world champion as the tester of every car that went out of the factory was an extraordinary advantage. But I think Ron spoke to me about his attitude to it, which was that everyone who got a Brabham car, or in later times a RAL, got exactly the same car as the works team would be using. The car that Jack or that Denny Hulme or others used, Dan Gurney and Jochen Rindt, and all of these people who were driving the works cars, if you bought a Brabham from their shop, then you'd get exactly the same thing. And that was very different. And he compared that to Lotus, who were using special trick cars for their works cars, and weren't exactly the same cars that the customers were given. And while many people, I think, suggest that that Colin Chapman was a great innovator, and no doubt there's a lot to that. One of the points Ron made about it was that in the end, Chapman had to go back to selling space frame cars for quite a while after he moved to Monocoque, because his customers really just couldn't manage to repair the cars and keep them going with a monocoque chassis. And Ron said he stuck with space frames for quite a while, mainly because he was a production racing car designer and builder, and his customers needed cars that they could repair easily anywhere around the world if they needed straightening for anything. And that was the kind of ethos of the place, that you got a good car. It was straightforward, simple, easy to look after and repair. And I think that's the kind of reputation that he built over a long period of time. And it probably goes a long way to explaining why he was the most successful production racing car designer in history. I think around 500 Brabhams and about 1,000 routes over his career.
And Ron
the whole
actually
space.
Yes, Robbie?
Sorry, Mark. Ron actually told me that he created things like on the rolls, the wishbones from left to right were made the same, so they were interchangeable. And that ties back into what you're saying, that for a privateer that's running through Europe that is doing events every weekend, that they could be carrying a small kit of parts,
yes,
and be quite competitive and not needing that support of the mothership with sending over new gearboxes and new front ends and all of the rest.
Well, yeah, I mean, wishbones were very important in all that. He said to me that the most important things about setting up a car at a track were camber and toe-in, and he designed wishbones and steering systems in such a way that those adjustments were able to be made very simply and very quickly. He said he tried to make it as simple to do and as quick to do, so that if you had to make adjustments when you were testing the car at the track, you could make the adjustments so quickly that the tyres would remain nice and hot and you could get back out on the track again. So that was the kind of approach. He had very practical, very down to earth. And if you're a trial and error guy, which I think, in many respects Ron was, and because we're talking about a time before computer design and a whole lot of other technological advancements that have changed the way people think about a lot of these things. But it was very much a trial and error process. So you had to be able to make changes that were simple and quick, and go out and see what the result was.
I think that the fact that he was a driver for 7 or 8 years or whatever it was himself, okay, not at elite level the way Brabham was, but the fact of the matter is that he understood the pressures that one is under at a race meeting, and it doesn't matter whether it's club level or Formula One, you're trying to do your best. So he understood innately what the demands of a driver were in terms of car setup through to driver comfort, which picks up the point that I was making before. The other thing that he proved, okay, Chapman came along with the Lotus 25 in 1962, and every man and his dog built monocoques. But the truth of the matter, or the fact of the matter, is that Ron was building a Grand Prix winning space frame in 1969. X won 2 Grands Prix with the BT26 in 1969, and it's been widely published everywhere. You would have all read it, that really the only reason he went to the monocoque in 1970 because the regulations around bagged fuel tanks basically mandated that he do it. Tony, you're right in saying that Chapman came back to the 59 and some of the 69s, not all of them were space frames. So he was actually man very much of his time, even though he had to put up with the odd jibe from other manufacturers that maybe thought they were making something that was a more advanced, in inverted commas, product. The results speak for themselves at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Ron mentioned to me that he said that he was about 2 years ahead of the other teams with his development, but he only ever did as much that he needed to do just to put himself in front, because he said if he did too much, then everyone would catch up and he'd be back to there. And I was astounded at that, because I thought, what kind of mind would be that far advanced from his peers who are at the top of their tree as well?
Yes.
The funny thing about that is that everybody copied him, including in Australia, and he didn't seem to let it worry him. I mean, I've got huge amounts of time for Bob Britton, Renmax, probably some of the people receiving this narrowcast that we're doing, if that's the name, but may have Renmax cars. You know, the BT23 was one of Ron's absolute great Formula 2 designs. Bob Britton created a jig at Renmax, and the car that, without boring you with the infinite detail, the car that Max Stewart won the 1971 Gold Star Championship in was essentially a knockoff of the BT23, which dates back to 1967. So you can just see little examples like that encapsulate a bloke with a generosity of spirit about people, you know, ripping off, if you want to put it strongly, his IP. But it also says a lot about the basic design. In that particular case, you know, his 1967 car with wings, simplifying it, was still competitive 4 years after it was built.
Mm.
Yes, and he often, I think, spoke of how he saw the whole process as one of evolution, you know, and
yeah,
that takes up Robbie's point that, and I certainly remember him saying to me that if all you wanted to do was build the absolute ultimate racing car, then you could do it. But that wasn't his aim. His aim was just to beat the opposition on the day, and of course that made it economical and simpler. But it was a little bit like, I remember talking a few years back to Gina Campbell, who was the daughter of Donald Campbell of Land Speed Record fame, and the thing that she was talking about was the way that all of the Land Speed Record drivers would try to just beat the previous record. They didn't want to go out and smash it for all time, because they got paid every time they beat the record, right? So
there you go. Interesting, isn't it?
Yes. So if you could beat it by a couple of miles an hour and become the new record holder, that was fine. But their objective in all of that process was to keep incrementally increasing the record speed. And I think that was the kind of thing that Ron was looking at. He was looking at his opposition. He was looking at what you needed to do to win. And in a interesting kind of parallel way, getting back to what Mark talked about the teamwork, from an engineering and design point of view, it's a rather similar sort of approach to what Jack Brabham's ethos was. He often spoke about winning at the slowest possible speed. You know, the idea that you just have to do enough to win.
Mm.
And I think that is another example of the way that the two of them seem to mesh together so incredibly well as a partnership.
And the other interesting...
I mean, go on.
Sorry, Mark. The other interesting story was that Ron sort of said that when, I think it might have been Jackie Crombie, the motoring journalist, alerted Ron and him and Jack that MRD in French meant shit, and that was one of the reasons they changed the name to Brabham. And it was sort of it was his decision. He was suggestion to actually use Brabham's name, and Ron never realised what implications that would have. That sort of did push him to the behind Jack in a way, as not so much a partnership, but it was sort of a funny little story behind it. But he never knew the implications of that, and yeah.
Yeah, I think Jack was a pretty Jack was a wily, tough customer. I mean, he and Chapman had a lot in common, really. You know, when Ron went over there, I had a quick look back through Mike Lawrence's book in the last couple of days just to remind me. But when he left Australia, essentially, he thought it was going to be a 50-50 thing. In the end, they agreed 60-40 in MRD. And a couple of years after they started the Grand Prix program, Jack decided that Brabham Racing Organisation should be formed to run the cars, and that would be entirely his, and a separate revenue stream. So that, you know, that created immediately certain tensions between, to an extent, the production of cars, because all of a sudden BRO were another customer of MRD rather than being in partnership. And they, you know, they still lived quite harmoniously, and all of that was only addressed, as you've all read probably, in the lead up to the 66 system, when Ron said, you know, Barley Charlie, it needs to be 50-50, and Jack was happy, in inverted commas, to go along with that. So, you know, it would be wrong to portray their relationship as a, you know, as being sensational all the while, or the sort of pressures upon them that any of us have been in business with partners occasionally experience.
Yeah, I think
but it was enduring all the same.
Yes, that's a fair comment. No, Ron thought a lot of Mike Lawrence's book. He said it was there was nothing in it that he disagreed with. So it's not a bad sort of comment from the subject of a biographer.
Bernie actually put a call into Ron or Mike Lawrence when he found out the book was being published to make sure that he was going to be portrayed in a good light, which I thought was quite funny.
Yeah, well, I mean, the famous line that Ron's repeated everywhere, and no doubt it's in the book somewhere, is that he never received the full amount of the contractual sum. And it probably wouldn't have been a surprise to anybody that Bernie tried to short pay him. But on the other hand, as soon as somebody like that's trying to stitch you up, you need to hop in shop and try and make sure that they pay what they're supposed to. But it sounds as though he didn't aggressively pursue that, and maybe on balance that was a smart thing to do given Bernie's power.
Yes, maybe so. But if anyone's really interested in the detail of Ron Tauranac's lengthy career, then Mike Lawrence's book is a terrific source, and of course that's Brabham plus Ralt plus Honda. And
there's actually, just building on your comment, Tony, there's a sensational section up the back of the book. It might be almost the final chapter before he gets to his appendices on results, which is his design ethos. You know, basically the key aspects, and there's only 10 or 12 of them, but they're basically the tenets by which he designed his cars right throughout, that make really interesting reading for those of you that are particularly of a technical bent.
Yeah, no, it's terrific stuff.
On the design ethos, I might throw in a funny story that when Ron came down to receive his lifetime award at CAMS, it might have been in 2017 or so, we visited Alan Hamilton, and I wanted him to go through his workshop, and Ron saw a 911 Porsche there, and soon after meeting Hamo, he sort of started to say all the things that were wrong with the design of the Porsche 911, and I was quite taken back because I was embarrassed, because I thought Alan's family had built their business and reputation on the 911s and following the 356. And sort of Alan paused for a little bit and said, well, look, they've actually been heralded as one of the best designed cars of the 20th century. And I think Ron paused for a little bit and said, maybe it's a triumph of engineering over design.
Yes.
And then Alan went on to say, well, actually, the early 911s, they did lift at the front, and they put the batteries in the front corners, and they tried lead weights initially and all of that. So he was in agreement, but that was Ron. He sort of spoke his mind, and sometimes people didn't know quite how to take it, but people realised that he was usually right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, the great success he had over roughly 3 decades that Mark talked about before was a real tribute to that. And clearly he was, without any doubt, if not the greatest racing car designer of the 20th century, then up there on the podium with whoever else you might mention. So I think I want to thank you both for joining me today to have this chat in memory of Ron, and I hope that the
Pleasure.
AHA members enjoy it. And when we established AHA back in 2015, our then president, our founding president, Harriet Enquist, approached Ron to be our patron, and she'd been corresponding with Ron about some of the Repco Brabham historical documents and drawings for the RMIT Design Archives. And when we formed AHA, we were thinking about who would be an appropriate sort of patron for an organisation that we hoped was going to have a degree of influence over the knowledge and research about Australia's automotive history. And Ron was the unanimous view of the committee at that time. And he was extremely gracious when we asked him to be the patron. He said, "I don't really know why you'd want me to be the patron." So we explained there were a few good reasons why we thought that somebody of his engineering and design background and the influence that he had on automotive design, and particularly the design of incredibly successful racing cars, really meant that he was an outstanding person in his own right, and we're very honoured for him to be the patron of our organisation. And it was just tremendous from that time onwards to be able to talk to Ron from time to time and gain a bit of insight about his attitude to designing racing cars and his approach to life. And he was just an absolute credit to all that he did over the years. I think that was the impression everyone got. So we hope that our AHA members appreciate how important it was for us to have Ron as our founding patron. And again, thanks Mark and thanks Robbie for spending a little bit of time today on some of our recollections. And we hope that the members of AHA and anyone else who has a listen to our recollections enjoys it and learns something a little bit more about Ron and his story. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Mark.
Cheers, Robbie.